Look closely at this wedding photograph from 1907. At first, it seems like any other celebration from that era. A young couple surrounded by family, frozen in a moment of joy. But here's what makes your skin crawl. For days after this image was captured in downtown Seattle, 3 of the people in this photograph would be dead, and the bride would vanish without a trace. What happened in those 4 days has puzzled investigators for over a century, and the answers hidden in this single image are more disturbing than you could imagine. The photograph was taken at Morrison's photography studio on 2nd Avenue in Seattle, Washington, a city exploding with wealth from the Klondike Gold Rush. It was September 1907, and Seattle was transforming from a frontier town into a modern metropolis almost overnight. Fortunes were being made and lost daily, and the city attracted not just prosperous businessmen, but also con artists, criminals, and people running from complicated pasts. The groom was 26 years old, a clerk at a shipping company that handled freight from Alaska. He had arrived in Seattle just 18 months earlier from Philadelphia, telling colleagues he wanted to make his fortune in the booming Pacific Northwest. By all accounts, he was quiet, hard-working, and kept mostly to himself. His boarding house landlady would later describe him as polite but distant, the kind of man who paid his rent on time and never caused trouble. The bride was 23, the daughter of a Swedish immigrant family that had settled in the Ballard neighborhood. Her father operated a small sawmill that supplied lumber for the city's rapid construction. She had worked as a seamstress before the marriage, known in the community for her skill with intricate embroidery. Friends described her as vivacious and ambitious, someone who dreamed of a life beyond the working-class neighborhood where she had grown up. The wedding itself was modest by the standards of Seattle's emerging elite, but respectable for a young couple of their social position. They married at a small Lutheran church in Ballard on a Saturday morning. About 30 guests attended, mostly family and a few friends from the bride's childhood. Interestingly, the groom's side of the church was nearly empty. He claimed his family back east was unable to make the long journey, but some guests noticed he seemed uncomfortable when asked about his parents or siblings. The photograph shows 7 people. The bride and groom sit in the center, she in a simple white dress with a high collar, he in a dark suit that looks slightly too large for his frame. Behind them stand her parents, her father with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades working with his hands, her mother in a severe black dress with her hair pulled back tightly. To the left is the bride's younger sister, about 16 years old, wearing a light-colored dress and holding a small bouquet. To the right are 2 men who were identified in later records as the groom's colleagues from the shipping company, included presumably because the groom had no family present. When you study their faces, something feels wrong. The bride's smile doesn't quite reach her eyes. Her father's hand on her shoulder appears to grip rather than rest. The groom stares directly at the camera with an intensity that seems almost aggressive. The younger sister's expression is the most telling. She looks frightened, her eyes wide and her posture rigid. One of the groom's colleagues has his gaze fixed not on the camera but on the groom himself, and there is something in that sideways glance that suggests wariness rather than friendship. The photographer later told police that the session had been tense. The groom had been particular about the arrangement, insisting on specific positions for each person. He had rejected the first 3 compositions the photographer suggested and had grown visibly agitated when the bride's mother questioned one of his decisions. The whole session had taken nearly 2 hours, unusually long for a simple wedding portrait, because the groom kept requesting adjustments until everything met his exact specifications. After the ceremony, the couple moved into a small house the groom had rented on Capitol Hill, a neighborhood that was becoming fashionable among Seattle's upwardly mobile middle class. The house was a modest 2-story wooden structure, typical of the period, with a small front porch and a yard that backed onto an alley. Neighbors would later recall seeing the bride hanging curtains in the windows that Sunday afternoon while the groom stood on the porch, smoking and watching the street. On Monday morning, the groom reported to work as usual. His supervisor noted nothing unusual about his demeanor, though one coworker mentioned he had seemed preoccupied and had made several errors in his paperwork, unusual for someone normally meticulous. The bride spent the day at home, and a neighbor saw her in the afternoon speaking with a delivery man who had brought furniture to the house. The neighbor remembered thinking the bride had looked pale and tired, but attributed it to the exhaustion natural after a wedding. Tuesday was when things began to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. The groom did not appear at work. His supervisor, concerned because the young man had never missed a day, sent a colleague to the house to check on him. The colleague knocked repeatedly but received no answer, though he could hear movement inside. Through a gap in the curtains, He glimpsed someone moving quickly past a window, but no one came to the door. Confused and somewhat alarmed, he returned to the office and reported what had happened. That same afternoon, the bride's mother arrived at the house, bringing food she had prepared for the newlyweds. She had sent a message that morning saying she would visit, and the bride had not replied, which was unlike her. When she reached the house and found the doors locked and no one answering her knocks, she became concerned. She walked around to the back and peered through the kitchen window. What she saw made her immediately rush to find the nearest telephone to call for help. The police arrived within 30 minutes. The scene they encountered would become one of Seattle's most baffling cases. The front door was locked from the inside. They forced entry through the back door, which had been secured with a simple latch. Inside, the house was in a state of careful disarray. Furniture had been moved, drawers had been opened and their contents examined, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Money was still in a jar in the kitchen, and the bride's jewelry box sat untouched on the bedroom dresser. The groom was found in the main bedroom, collapsed beside the bed. The initial assessment suggested he had been dead for at least 12 hours, meaning he had died sometime during Monday night or early Tuesday morning. The cause was not immediately apparent, though there were signs of some kind of struggle or convulsion. His face was contorted, his hands clenched, and there was foam dried at the corners of his mouth. The bride's father was discovered in the small parlor downstairs. He had clearly been dead longer, possibly since Monday evening. He was seated in a chair near the fireplace, slumped forward, and like the groom showed signs that his final moments had been distressing. There were no visible wounds on either man, no signs of violence in the traditional sense, but something had clearly gone catastrophically wrong. The bride herself was nowhere to be found. Her coat was missing from the hook near the door, as was a small travel bag her mother recognized. Some of her clothes were gone, along with personal items, suggesting she had deliberately packed and left. But when? And under what circumstances? And most troubling of all, where was the bride's younger sister, who had been seen entering the house on Monday afternoon by a neighbor who recognized her from the wedding photograph? The sister was found Tuesday evening in the basement, hidden behind a stack of storage crates in the coal cellar. She was alive but deeply traumatized, unable or unwilling to speak. Her dress was torn and dirty, and she bore bruises on her arms consistent with being forcibly restrained. When police tried to question her, she became hysterical, screaming and trying to flee. A doctor was called, and she was sedated and taken to her parents' home, where her mother tried desperately to coax information from her about what had happened. The investigation that followed revealed layers of deception that shocked the community. The groom, it turned out, was not who he claimed to be. His real name was different from the one he had used in Seattle, and he had left Philadelphia under circumstances that were, at best, suspicious. Records showed he had been employed by a bank there, but had been dismissed under circumstances the bank refused to discuss. He had left town shortly after a wealthy client had died suddenly, leaving a will that named the groom as a beneficiary of a substantial sum. That will had been contested by the client's family, who claimed it was a forgery, but before the matter could be resolved in court, the young man had disappeared. Further investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The groom had been married before, twice. His first wife had died in Philadelphia in 1904 under circumstances that had briefly raised questions. She had been found dead in their apartment, and while the official cause was listed as heart failure, her family had insisted she had been in perfect health. No investigation had been pursued because there was no evidence of foul play. His second wife had died in Portland, Oregon in 1906. Again, the death had been sudden and unexpected. Again, heart failure had been the official explanation. The shipping company where he worked discovered that significant discrepancies existed in their accounts, specifically in the division that handled payments for freight from Alaska. Money had been systematically diverted over the past year, small amounts that individually would not be noticed but that collectively totaled several $1,000s. The groom had been in a perfect position to manipulate these accounts, and the pattern of theft matched exactly with his tenure at the company. The bride's father, investigators learned, had confronted the groom on Monday evening. A business associate revealed that the father had discovered something troubling about the groom's past and had gone to the Capitol Hill house to demand an explanation. What exactly he had learned was never definitively established, but it clearly had been serious enough for him to feel he needed to intervene immediately, despite his daughter having just married this man. The most disturbing discovery came from the office of a local physician. On Monday afternoon, just hours before he died, the groom had visited this doctor, claiming he was suffering from severe headaches and needed medication. The doctor had prescribed a common remedy of the era, but when investigators checked his records, they found that the groom had specifically asked about the effects of certain substances, including several that were deadly in the wrong doses. The doctor had thought the questions odd at the time, but had not considered them particularly alarming. In 1907, many medications and poisons were readily available, and people often educated themselves about such matters. Here's where the case takes its most chilling turn. When the bodies were examined more thoroughly by a coroner brought in from San Francisco, someone with more advanced training than was typically available in Seattle at the time, he determined that both men had died from poisoning. The specific substance was one that would have caused the symptoms observed: convulsions, frothing at the mouth, and a relatively quick but agonizing death. More importantly, this poison was one that could be administered in food or drink without the victim being immediately aware. The bride's mother provided a critical piece of information. On Sunday evening, the day after the wedding, the bride had come to visit her parents alone. She had seemed agitated and had asked strange questions about her father's will and about what would happen to the sawmill if something happened to him. When her mother had asked what was troubling her, the bride had claimed she was simply worried about the future and wanted to understand the family's financial situation. The mother had thought it odd, but had attributed it to the normal anxieties of a newly married woman starting a household. The younger sister, when she finally began to speak weeks later, provided fragments of information that were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. She said she had gone to the house on Monday afternoon because her sister had sent her a note asking her to come, claiming she needed help with something. When she arrived, the groom had been behaving strangely, pacing and muttering to himself. Her sister had seemed frightened but had told her to stay, that everything would be fine. Then their father had arrived, and there had been shouting. The sister remembered her brother-in-law preparing tea, remembered everyone drinking it, and then chaos. Her father had started gasping, clutching his chest. The groom had staggered to the bedroom. And her sister, her beautiful, ambitious sister, had looked at her with eyes that held no recognition, no mercy, and had told her she was sorry, so sorry, before locking her in the basement. The search for the bride became a regional obsession. Police distributed the wedding photograph to newspapers across the West Coast. Sightings were reported from Vancouver to San Francisco, but none proved credible. Some investigators believed she had fled to California, perhaps to start a new life under an assumed name. Others thought she might have headed inland, to one of the remote mining towns where questions were rarely asked and pasts were easy to obscure. A few even speculated she had traveled north to Alaska, where the lawlessness of the gold fields would provide perfect cover. A particularly compelling theory emerged when a Seattle detective discovered that tickets for a steamship to San Francisco had been purchased on Tuesday morning, just hours after the deaths, by a woman matching the bride's description. The name used was false, and no passenger list could definitively confirm her presence on that ship, but the timing was suspicious. If she had indeed taken that vessel, she would have reached California days before police even began searching for her, giving her ample time to disappear into that state's growing population. Financial records revealed that the bride had withdrawn her entire savings from her bank account on Monday morning, before her father's visit to the house. The amount was modest but would have been enough to support her for several months while she established herself somewhere new. She had also sold some jewelry to a pawnbroker that same day, transactions that suggested she had been planning her departure even before the deaths occurred. The question that haunted investigators was this: had she known what her husband was planning? Had she been complicit in the poisoning of her own father? Or had she somehow been manipulated by a man who had apparently killed before? Some argued that her actions in the days before the deaths proved her guilt. Others insisted she had been a victim herself, married to a dangerous man and forced to make impossible choices in a moment of terror. The wedding photograph was examined and re-examined for clues. That frightened look in the younger sister's eyes suddenly made sense. She had somehow sensed the danger that her sister was walking into, even if she could not articulate it at the time. The tight grip of the father's hand on his daughter's shoulder now seemed less affectionate and more like a man trying to hold onto someone slipping away from safety. And the bride's smile, that smile that did not reach her eyes, looked now like the expression of someone who already knew she had made a terrible mistake but could not find a way back. Years later, a woman living in Los Angeles under a different name was briefly investigated as a possible match for the missing bride. She was the right age, and she bore a passing resemblance to the woman in the photograph, but she had documentation proving she had lived in California her entire life. The investigation went nowhere. In 1923, a deathbed confession from a woman in Portland claimed to know what had happened to the Seattle bride, but the story she told was inconsistent and possibly the ravings of someone in the final stages of illness. In 1935, a skeleton was discovered during construction in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood, and for a time there was speculation it might be the missing woman, but forensic examination suggested the remains were much older. The bride's younger sister never fully recovered from the trauma. She spent years in and out of institutions that treated nervous disorders, as they were called then. She never married, never held employment for long, and died in 1931 at age 40, her potential extinguished by those terrible hours in the basement of the Capitol Hill house. The bride's mother lived until 1940, spending her final decades refusing to speak about her daughter or the events of 1907. The sawmill was sold, the family scattered, and the story gradually faded from public memory. What really happened in that house remains one of Seattle's enduring mysteries. Did the groom plan to kill his new father-in-law, perhaps to prevent exposure of his past crimes? Did the bride discover his intentions and choose to flee rather than become his next victim? Or was the truth even darker? Some modern analysts have suggested that the bride may have been the primary actor, possibly in collusion with her husband to murder her father for his business, only to turn on her accomplice when things went wrong. Others maintain she was simply a victim of circumstance, married to a monster and forced to choose between her family and her survival. The wedding photograph remains in the Seattle Historical Society archives, a stark reminder that our happiest moments can sit adjacent to our darkest hours. Those 7 people posed together on what should have been a day of celebration, unaware that they were documenting not a beginning but an ending. The image has been reproduced in numerous books about historical crimes, analyzed by criminologists and psychologists, and continues to draw researchers who hope to finally solve the mystery of what happened to the bride who vanished. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case is how easily someone can disappear when they truly want to. In an era before comprehensive identification systems, before databases and digital tracking, a determined person with even modest resources could simply step off into a new life and never be found. Somewhere, perhaps, the bride from that 1907 wedding photograph lived out her days under another name, carrying the weight of what happened in that house on Capitol Hill. Or perhaps her story ended far sooner and more tragically than anyone knew. The photograph offers no answers, only questions that echo across more than a century of speculation and doubt.